For decades, the story was simple and almost unquestioned. The United States stood at the center of global trade, deciding who gained access, who benefited, and who was quietly pushed aside. Africa, in that story, was always the one asking, negotiating, adjusting. Washington held the keys and African economies were expected to fall in line. That was the assumption. That was the power dynamic everyone accepted. But today, that story is starting to crack. And what is emerging is something few people in Washington expected. Because something unusual just happened. The African Growth and Opportunity Act, better known as AGOA, expired. No dramatic countdown. No emergency diplomatic flights. No televised pleas from African leaders. Just silence. And that silence spoke louder than any protest ever could. The agreement that once symbolized American leverage over African trade simply ended, and Africa didn't flinch. No panic, no collapse, no desperate scramble. Instead, business continued. Ships kept moving, factories kept producing, and markets quietly adjusted. This is where the real shift begins. AGOA was never just a trade deal. On the surface, it was sold as generosity, duty-free access to the US market, support for African exports, a partnership meant to encourage development. But beneath that language, AGOA was a tool of control. It allowed Washington to decide which countries were eligible, which governments were behaving correctly, and which ones needed to be punished. Access could be granted, suspended, or threatened depending on political alignment. For more than 25 years, that leverage worked because the US market was seen as irreplaceable. But the world has changed, and while many in Washington were slow to notice, Africa had already begun adjusting, quietly, strategically, without announcing a grand break from the West. And South Africa, more than any other country, was at the center of this shift. For years, South Africa was one of AGOA's biggest beneficiaries, exporting not just raw materials, but finished industrial products into the US economy. Cars, auto parts, chemicals, agricultural goods, processed foods. These weren't symbolic exports. They were deeply embedded in American supply chains. So when AGOA expired, logic suggested South Africa would be the first to feel the pain. Factories should have slowed. Jobs should have been threatened. Politicians should have panicked. None of that happened. Instead, something uncomfortable became clear. The leverage Washington believed it had was no longer as strong as it thought. And while South Africa remained calm, something very different was happening inside the United States. Behind closed doors, American industries began to react. Because AGOA had not only helped Africa export to the US, it had quietly helped American companies survive. South Africa had become a reliable source of high-quality, lower-cost goods that met US standards. When the agreement ended, tariffs returned, costs increased, and suddenly the pressure landed where few expected it to. On American companies, on American consumers, on an economy already sensitive to inflation. That's when the tone in Washington began to change. Instead of confidence, there was urgency. Instead of conditions, there were conversations about extensions. Congress began rushing legislation to revive the very agreement it once used as leverage. And this reversal exposed something deeper than a trade dispute. It revealed that the balance of dependence had shifted. Because for the first time in decades, Africa, especially South Africa, was no longer negotiating from fear. It had options. And when a country has options, pressure stops working. This is not a story about AGOA ending, it's a story about dependence ending. And once dependence disappears, power quietly changes hands. To understand why this reversal shocked Washington, you have to understand what AGOA really was from the very beginning. Not the version explained in speeches, but the version that actually mattered. When AGOA was created in the year 2000, the United States was already facing a problem it didn't want to admit. Manufacturing was leaving. Labour costs were rising. Global competition was increasing. And rebuilding industry at home was politically expensive. So instead of fixing the problem internally, Washington found another solution. Move production outward, but keep control of the market. AGOA allowed African countries to produce goods cheaply and funnel them directly into American supply chains, while US companies enjoyed low costs without paying American wages. It looked like development aid, but it functioned like outsourcing with political strings attached. South Africa became the most important piece of that system. Unlike many African countries that mainly exported raw materials, South Africa supplied finished goods, complex goods, industrial goods, products that required skilled labour, infrastructure, and reliability, automobiles and components, chemicals, processed agricultural products. These were not optional imports for the US economy. They were structural. For years, American companies quietly built their business models around this reality. AGOA made it easy. No heavy tariffs, minimal friction, predictable supply. And because it worked so smoothly, many US industries stopped thinking about what would happen if the agreement disappeared. They assumed it always would exist because Washington assumed it controlled the relationship. But South Africa was thinking differently. While AGOA made trade easier, Pretoria never treated it as permanent. Years of political pressure from the US and Europe sent a clear message. Trade access could be weaponized, it could be threatened, it could be taken away. So instead of trusting the arrangement, South Africa began preparing for a future without it. This preparation didn't come with dramatic announcements. There was no loud rejection of the West. There were no emotional speeches. It happened quietly through diversification. South African exporters began selling more to Asia. China, India, and Southeast Asia steadily absorbed more manufactured goods, minerals, and agricultural products. At the same time, the Middle East became a strong destination for processed foods and industrial supplies. Inside Africa itself, something else was happening. Regional trade expanded, transport routes improved, intra-African demand increased. Slowly, South Africa reduced its reliance on any single market. This is the part many analysts missed. Because when diversification works, it doesn't look dramatic. It looks boring. Shipments are rerouted, contracts are renegotiated, markets adjust. So when AGOA expired, South Africa didn't panic because it didn't have to. The economy didn't collapse. Factories didn't shut down en masse. Politicians didn't rush to Washington. Instead, exporters adjusted like they had been doing for years. Some redirected goods. Some absorbed short-term costs. Some focused on regional buyers. The system bent, but it didn't break. Meanwhile, in the United States, the shock was immediate. Tariffs returned overnight. Costs rose. Supply chains tightened. American companies realized replacing South Africa was not simple. Other suppliers were either more expensive, slower, or unable to meet quality standards. Car makers warned of rising production costs. Retailers warned of higher food prices. Importers warned that inflation pressures would increase. And suddenly AGOA wasn't being discussed as a gift to Africa anymore. It was being discussed as a necessity for America. Lobbyists flooded Congress. Reports piled up. The message was blunt. Ending AGOA was hurting US industries more than African exporters. In an economy already struggling with inflation, that was unacceptable. This is when the power dynamic quietly flipped, because the agreement Washington once used to apply pressure had become a shield protecting its own economy. And when that shield disappeared, the vulnerability was exposed. That's why Congress moved quickly. That's why the language softened. That's why extension talks appeared almost immediately. AGOA didn't return because Africa begged. It returned because America needed it. And once that reality became clear, the old threats lost their force. What made this moment even more revealing was how ineffective American pressure suddenly became. For years, access to the US market had been used as a quiet warning. Align politically, and trade flows smoothly. Step out of line, and benefits can disappear. This strategy worked for a long time, because African countries believed losing Western access would be catastrophic. Fear did the work. Compliance followed. But when AGOA expired, that fear was gone. And Washington noticed. Before the collapse, the United States had already been pushing South Africa on several fronts. Criticism over foreign policy decisions, warnings about diplomatic alignment, subtle signals that trade privileges could be reviewed. In another era, this would have triggered fast adjustments. But this time nothing changed. South Africa didn't reverse its positions. It didn't rush to reassure Washington. It didn't issue apologies or clarifications. It simply stayed on its path. And that calm response sent a message more powerful than any statement. The leverage no longer worked. The threat had lost its weight. This was uncomfortable for Washington because it exposed a deeper problem. Power based on dependency only works as long as dependency exists. Once alternatives are in place, pressure turns into noise. And South Africa had already built those alternatives. By the time AGOA ended, the US market was no longer the centre of South Africa's trade universe. It was one option among many. That realisation forced a choice in Washington: escalate pressure and risk pushing South Africa further away, or retreat and stabilise the relationship. Escalation would have meant tariffs, harsher language, and political confrontation. But escalation only works when the other side is trapped. South Africa wasn't. So the United States chose retreat. Not publicly, not dramatically, but clearly. The language softened, the threats disappeared. Suddenly, officials spoke about mutual benefit and shared interests. Congress moved quickly to revive the agreement, not with new demands, but with urgency. This shift matters because it reveals something fundamental. When a powerful country stops issuing commands and starts explaining itself, the balance has already changed. And South Africa understood that, but it didn't celebrate, it didn't provoke, it didn't gloat, it stayed quiet. Because confidence doesn't need noise. Behind this calm was a deeper change in mindset. For decades, trade decisions were made around one central question: how do we protect access to Western markets? Losing that access once meant disaster. So policy followed caution. But diversification changed the question. It became simpler and far more powerful. What is this market worth compared to others? That shift from survival thinking to evaluation thinking is where real power moves. Because once you start comparing instead of begging, you gain leverage. South African exporters began weighing American contracts against Asian demand. They compared shipping routes, political risk, and long-term stability. Sometimes the US still made sense. Sometimes it didn't. And that freedom changed everything. AGOA's return didn't trigger celebration in South Africa because it was no longer essential. It was useful. And when something is merely useful, it no longer controls you. This is why Washington's old playbook failed. It was built for a world where options were limited. That world no longer exists. And the most important part is that South Africa didn't break ties to reach this position. It didn't reject the US. It simply outgrew dependence. What happened with AGOA is not just a trade story. It is a signal. A quiet one, but an important one. It shows how power shifts not through confrontation, but through preparation. South Africa didn't challenge the United States head-on. It didn't announce a break from the Western system. It simply built enough alternatives that pressure stopped working. And that is the part many people miss. Power today doesn't belong only to the loudest voice or the biggest economy. It belongs to the side with options. When you have options, you don't need to threaten. You don't need to rush. You don't need to beg. You can afford to wait, evaluate, and choose. This is why the AGOA extension didn't feel like a victory in South Africa. There were no celebrations, no speeches about triumph, because nothing was rescued. The economy was not hanging off a cliff. The extension was accepted calmly, the same way you accept an ID, offer you don't depend on. And that calm revealed everything. At the same time, the United States was forced to confront a new reality. It can no longer assume loyalty based on access. It can no longer expect alignment simply because its market is large. In a multipolar trade world, size alone is not enough. Reliability matters. Stability matters. Respect matters. This is especially important because South Africa is not alone. Other African countries are watching closely. They are seeing that diversification works. They are seeing that reducing dependence does not require burning bridges. It requires patience, planning, and consistency. Build regional markets. Expand partnerships. Reduce political risk. What AGOA's collapse and rushed revival really exposed is that the old hierarchy is fading. Not overnight. Not dramatically. But steadily. African economies, especially the larger ones, are learning how to move without fear. And when fear disappears, leverage follows. The United States still matters in global trade. That hasn't changed. But it is no longer the uncontested centre. It is one player in a crowded field, and that means relationships must now be negotiated, not imposed. Influence must be earned, not assumed. South Africa's response showed what that future looks like. Calm, quiet, strategic. No dramatic break. Just a shift in posture. From dependency to choice. From compliance to negotiation. AGOA didn't fail because Africa rejected it. It failed because Africa no longer needed it to survive. And when survival is no longer the question, everything changes. This is why this moment matters. Not because a trade deal expired and returned, but because a mindset ended. The idea that access equals control is fading, and in its place is something far more balanced. The tables didn't turn with an announcement, they turned when Africa stopped panicking.